The ocean remembers everything. Long after the guns fall silent, after empires dissolve and names fade from history's tongue, the sea keeps its quiet record, the wrecks, the echoes, the drifting steel bones of ambition. In the Second World War, it became not just a boundary, but a battlefield without borders, and nowhere did it rage more unseen than beneath the Pacific's shifting skin. There, in the dim corridors of pressure and darkness, the United States Navy waged a war of shadows against an empire that had once seemed invincible. The surface fleets fought their grand engagements, Midway, Leyte, the Philippine Sea, but it was the submarines that choked Japan's arteries, cutting the lines that fed its cities, its armies, its faith in endurance. They were called the Silent Service, men who lived not by glory, but by patience, who breathed recycled air and slept beside torpedoes, whose victories were measured in tonnage and silence. Between 1941 and 1945, 52 American submarines would vanish into the depths, their crews entombed in steel coffins. Yet for every one lost, another prowled unseen, turning the Pacific into a hunting ground of ghosts. Amid this invisible war, one submarine began to write its own mythology. USS Barb, hull number SS-220, slid into the sea in 1942, a Gato-class vessel forged in Groton shipyards. She was not remarkable by design. 301 feet of riveted steel, 10 torpedo tubes, a deck gun, diesel engines that rattled like bones when pushed to their limits. Her soul, however, would prove singular, not because of her metal, but because of the man who commanded her. Commander Eugene Fluckey was the kind of leader war rarely creates twice. Born in Washington, D.C., tempered by Annapolis discipline, he was equal parts tactician, engineer, and dreamer. His eyes, sharp and restless, saw opportunity where others saw only risk. He understood the logic of war, but he also understood its psychology. To defeat an enemy utterly, one must make him believe he is already defeated. Fluckey's reputation was forged not through recklessness, but through calculation so daring it appeared reckless. On earlier patrols, he had driven the Barb into shallow waters to attack convoys where no submarine should venture. He had surfaced amid gunfire to rescue downed airmen, and once charged into a harbor so tightly defended that escape seemed impossible. Yet he returned, leaving behind burning wrecks. The Barb's crew adored him. They were a fraternity of extremes, machinists, torpedomen, radar operators, electricians, drawn from small towns and shipyards, each hardened by the strange intimacy of submarine life. They ate together, sweated together, dreamed in turns upon the same narrow bunks. The air aboard was thick with diesel, fear, and humor, the kind that comes only from men who have seen death's face too often to be polite about it. By 1945, their record was a legend in motion. The Barb had sunk enemy freighters, tankers, even warships, evading depth charges that fell like God's hammers from the sky. Each patrol pushed them deeper into the heart of Japan's empire, where waters grew shallow, defenses thicker, and targets rarer. For the Japanese, these submarines were invisible assassins, slipping past patrol lines to strike without warning. For the men inside, they were both predators and prey. The war was nearing its crescendo. American bombers now roamed above Japan. The great carrier fleets lay poised offshore. Yet even in its dying months, the empire clung to a stubborn rhythm. Ships still sailed, trains still ran, factories still hummed. To Fluckey, that persistence was not just defiance, it was vulnerability. He began to study the enemy's coasts, tracing railway lines that paralleled the sea. They fed Japan's last supply routes, connecting ports to factories, cities to arsenals. He imagined those lines like veins pulsing with the last blood of a fading empire, and somewhere in that vision the seed of an idea began to form, a question that no one in the history of naval warfare had ever asked. Could a submarine strike not just from the sea, but onto the land itself? The answer would take form in darkness beneath foreign stars, where the sea met the railways of northern Japan. Before the war's end, the USS Barb would commit an act so unorthodox, so improbable, that even seasoned admirals would struggle to believe it had happened. It would begin not with a battle, but with a whisper, a rumor among submariners of a captain who dared to dream beyond the ocean. The orders arrived, folded in oil-stained paper, sealed with routine precision, yet the coordinates they contained were anything but routine. They pointed north, far north, toward the latticed coasts of Hokkaido and the bitter straits that divided Japan from the Soviet frontier. To most commanders, that region was a labyrinth of danger. Shallow bays mined like trapdoors, patrol craft restless as hornets, aircraft ranging out of coastal airfields. To Commander Eugene Fluckey, it was opportunity drawn in ink. The Barb slipped from Midway's lagoon in late May 1945, her black hull parting the pale coral water like a thought escaping its source. On deck, the men watched the horizon until it folded behind them. Then they descended into the familiar half-light of the boat. Within hours, the ocean closed over their heads, and the war became again a matter of vibrations and instruments. Inside a submarine, time loses its geometry. Days blend into circuits of routine watch, eat, sleep, repair, dive, surface, repeat, until each heartbeat seems governed by the hum of motors. The air grows warm, metallic, faintly sweet with oil and sweat. Conversations shrink to murmurs. Laughter comes quick, edged by nerves. In that world, imagination either withers or sharpens into something dangerous. Fluckey's imagination sharpened. Night after night he bent over maps in the wardroom, the table lamp a small sun illuminating coastlines drawn by foreign surveyors decades earlier. There, etched in fine ink, he traced the veins of Japan. Thin railway lines running parallel to the sea, feeding coal from Sakhalin mines to Hokkaido's ports, carrying munitions south toward the factories that still clanged despite the bombing. If those rails could be broken, even briefly, the blow would echo louder than a dozen sunken freighters. He spoke little of it at first. To plant an explosive on land from a submarine defied every doctrine in the book. Submariners fought in water, not on beaches, but Fluckey had long ago stopped confusing doctrine with destiny. The Barb moved north through fog that clung to the sea like breath on glass. Her radar mast cut a pale halo when she surfaced at night. During the day, she sank again into the gray quiet. Every few hours came the hollow ping of enemy sonar sweeping blindly for intruders. The crew learned to read those sounds as sailors once read stars. There were encounters, 2 small freighters escorted by gunboats, coastal barges loaded with timber or coal. Fluckey attacked when conditions favored speed and invisibility. Torpedoes struck, explosions rolled across the water, and then the submarine slid away before retaliation could arrive. Each victory, however, left the captain more restless. Ships were fair game. He wanted the impossible. By mid-June, they reached the Sea of Okhotsk. The world there was colder, lonelier. Ice still drifted in patches, scoured white by wind. At dawn, the men could glimpse mountains, faint on the horizon, Sakhalin, dark and forested. Through the periscope, Fluckey studied the shoreline. Fishing hamlets, a few sheds, telephone poles strung along the railway embankment. From the sea, he could almost read the timetables of trains as they passed. He began a slow reconnaissance. Each night the Barb edged closer to shore. engines barely turning, her hull brushing the topography of the seabed. The navigator marked depths and bearings until they knew the coast as intimately as their own ship. Once, in moonlight, they sighted sparks from a locomotive far inland, moving north to south. A spectral reminder that Japan, though starving, still moved. The idea took shape fully then. If they could reach that line, plant an explosive charge beneath it, and withdraw unseen, they would have done what no American force had yet attempted: strike the home islands by hand. The problem was how. The Barb carried no landing craft, no Marines-only sailors trained for undersea mechanics and torpedo warfare. Yet within that limitation lay ingenuity. Fluckey called for volunteers. He need not have asked twice. Every man aboard stepped forward. From those, he selected 8 fit, agile, steady under pressure. They would become, for one night, commandos without a flag. The rest of the crew began to improvise. In the torpedo room, they assembled a demolition device using spare parts, a block of high explosive, and a detonator adapted from a depth charge fuse. They added a pressure switch scavenged from a torpedo's firing mechanism, calibrated to trigger under the weight of a train wheel. The timer would be unnecessary. The train itself would pull the trigger. Meanwhile, the officers rehearsed navigation. Using the periscope bearings and landmarks seen by moonlight, they plotted a landing point, a narrow beach near the village of Kashiho, where the railway curved within a few dozen yards of the surf. The approach would have to be exact. Too far east, and they would strike rocks. Too far west, and they would ground in mud. Fluckey scheduled the attempt for the darkest phase of the moon. Until then, they patrolled the area, sinking what targets they could, dodging air patrols that swept down the coast each morning. The men grew gaunt, sleepless, wired by anticipation. The thought of stepping ashore, of touching enemy soil after years, confined to steel, haunted them in equal parts terror and fascination. On the eve of the mission, Fluckey wrote a brief entry in the log: "Intent to conduct special operation against railway target on Japanese mainland. Crew confident." He said nothing of glory or revenge. His motives were simpler: to prove that imagination could be a weapon. When the appointed night arrived, the sea lay eerily calm. Clouds covered the stars, the horizon dissolved into ink. The Barb surfaced 3 miles off the coast, her decks slick with condensation. Engines idled to silence. In the forward compartment, the 8 chosen men prepared their gear pistols, flashlights masked with tape, the demolition charge packed in a canvas bag. They checked each component by touch, for light was forbidden. Fluckey watched them climb the conning tower ladder one by one, silhouettes against the faint phosphorescence of the sea. He said nothing. Words would have diminished the moment. They lowered the rubber boat into the water. Oars dipped. Ripples spread outward and vanished. Within minutes, the craft was swallowed by darkness. On the bridge, the captain listened to the whisper of waves against the hull, each second an eternity. Out there, invisible against the coast, his men were crossing the final frontier of the submarine war, the line where water meets land, where imagination becomes history. The sea that night lay like glass, black and depthless, reflecting no stars, no horizon, only the illusion of infinite distance. The Barb floated upon it like a breath held too long. Every man aboard knew that silence was their only armor. To be detected here, so close to Japan's own coast, was to die without a trace. It was the 22nd of July, 1945. The war had entered its last, most fevered weeks. To the men who crouched in the submarine's forward compartment, the outside world might as well have been another planet. They existed now within a bubble of breath and pressure, waiting for a moment that would compress the entire war into a single act. The landing party assembled around the demolition charge, a cylindrical mass of explosive fitted with the improvised pressure detonator. They called it, with grim humor, the canary, for it would sing its note only once. Each man carried a section of the load, along with pistols, a flashlight, and a small spade. No one spoke. Conversation was useless in a place where one whisper could carry across the still water like a gunshot. Fluckey stood on the bridge, binoculars raised, scanning the shoreline. A faint line of surf shimmered faintly in the gloom. Beyond it rose the outline of low dunes and sparse trees. He checked his watch, just past midnight. Conditions could not have been more favorable. No wind, no moon, the tide in their favor. Yet the captain felt the weight of responsibility like cold iron against his chest. He would remain aboard. Command could not risk itself on land. Leadership, he knew, sometimes meant staying behind while others walked into darkness. At 12:45 a.m., the rubber boat was lowered over the side. Its surface gleamed with a film of condensation, phosphorescent plankton swirling in its wake as the oars dipped. 8 silhouettes slid aboard. Chief gunner's mate, Paul Saunders, electrician's mate, Billy Hatfield, motor machinist's mate, Francis Sever, torpedoman, William Walker, and 4 others whose names history would record only in lists. They were young, but their faces were set in the calm of those who had already made peace with consequence. The oars moved silently. The Barb dwindled behind them, a darker shape against the dark. From the bridge, Fluckey could barely see the faint movement of the boat, only the glint of a paddle catching stray light from the horizon. The minutes stretched unbearably. The men in the water could hear nothing but their breathing and the soft hiss of surf growing louder ahead. They grounded on sand. The air smelled of kelp and smoke from unseen houses inland. Pulling the boat ashore, they crouched low, scanning for movement. Nothing. The land was asleep. For the first time in the war, American sailors stood on Japanese soil. They moved inland in pairs, keeping to the shadows. The beach gave way to low grass, then a rise of sand leading to the railway embankment. A telegraph wire hummed faintly overhead, alive with the distant rhythm of coded transmissions, Japan's nervous system whispering through the night. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once, then fell silent. At the top of the embankment, the rails gleamed faintly under the mist. One of the men pressed his palm to the cold steel. It vibrated gently, the faint pulse of an approaching train, still miles distant. They worked quickly. The charge was placed beneath the sleepers, the detonator aligned carefully with the left-hand rail. Hatfield knelt in the dirt, his hands steady despite the tremor of adrenaline. He connected the circuit, checked the contact points, then buried the device beneath gravel and grass until the track looked untouched. Every second stretched. The silence around them grew immense, like the pause between thunderclaps. When the task was done, Saunders signaled the others to withdraw. They crept back toward the beach, their boots sinking into sand, hearts pounding in the fragile quiet. Reaching the boat, they pushed it into the surf. The tide had turned, and the current pulled against them. Muscles burned as they rowed, each stroke heavier than the last. Behind them, the coast remained still, featureless, waiting. In the distance, the faint hum on the rail had grown stronger. A train was coming. By the time they reached the Barb, the sky in the east had begun to pale with the first hint of dawn. The men clambered aboard, breathless, drenched in sweat and seawater. Fluckey was waiting on the bridge. He said nothing, only nodded once, sharply, as if to punctuate the moment. The submarine slipped beneath the surface, descending to periscope depth. All eyes turned to the captain. Through the scope he watched the shoreline, the faint gray band between sea and sky. Minutes passed. The tension became unbearable. Then it happened. A flash, bright even through the mist. A column of fire rose into the air, followed by a thunderous concussion that rolled across the water. The sound reached them seconds later, a deep, tearing roar that seemed to shake the ocean itself. For a heartbeat, the night turned to daylight. When the glare faded, nothing remained where the track had been. The train was gone. Men gripped each other's shoulders, mouths open in disbelief. Some laughed silently. Others simply stared, unable to comprehend what they had done. The Barb's control room filled with the strange, electric stillness that follows triumph too vast for language. Somewhere above them, debris was still falling like rain onto the forest. The blast had not merely destroyed a train, it had erased the boundary between sea and land, redefining what a submarine could do. In that instant, the USS Barb ceased to be merely a weapon. She became a myth. Fluckey lowered the periscope and exhaled slowly. He ordered the boat turned seaward. The engines whispered to life, and the submarine glided back into the depths from which she had come. No one aboard yet knew that they had just carried out the only direct ground attack on the Japanese home islands by American forces during the entire war. By dawn, the Barb was miles offshore, running deep. The crew gathered in the mess, still damp and grinning, as the cook passed out mugs of bitter coffee. They did not toast, nor boast. Their laughter was quiet, almost reverent. Outside, the sea rolled over their wake, erasing every trace. At 3 a.m., the ocean was once again black glass, the only movement the pulse of bubbles slipping past the hull. Deep inside the Barb, men sat wordless at their stations, still half-stunned by what they had heard. The sound of the explosion had not merely reached them, it had entered them, a vibration that traveled through steel and bone, the physical proof that imagination had detonated into reality. Fluckey stood in the conning tower, one hand resting on the periscope handles. He had seen the fireball bloom, a sudden torch against the mist, then scatter into fragments like sparks from a forge. For a long moment afterward, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the echo-deep rolling, alive with destruction, stretching across the sea until it became indistinguishable from the wind itself. Even for a man who had witnessed ships exploding under torpedo fire, it was something new. This had been an act of creation through annihilation. He felt neither joy nor regret, only the solemn awe of a craftsman watching his design fulfill itself. Below him the crew waited for orders. He gave them quietly. "Secure from battle stations, course east by northeast, depth 100 feet. No fanfare, no speech. In war, even miracles must be filed away as procedures." The Barb glided seaward, her electric motors thrumming softly. Every so often the sonar man reported distant detonations, perhaps fuel cars still burning on shore, perhaps ammunition cooking off in the wreck. Each report drew murmured guesses and suppressed laughter. The men did not yet understand that they had made history. They only knew they had done something no other submarine crew had ever attempted and survived. By dawn, the first patrol aircraft arrived. Their engines could be heard faintly through the water, a rhythmic growl like thunder muffled by depth. Fluckey ordered the submarine down to 200 feet. The hull creaked. Condensation dripped from pipes onto the deck. The air grew hot and heavy, but no one complained. They had been tested and not found wanting. Hours passed in a suspension of time. When the boat finally surfaced again that evening, the sky was clear and wide, streaked with crimson light. The men emerged one by one, blinking in the sudden brightness. The smell of the sea rushed in, a clean, living smell after the mechanical air of the depths. Someone began to hum softly, an old song about going home. No one stopped him. Far behind them, the coast still burned. Through binoculars, the captain could see a smudge of smoke rising where the rails had been. He wondered who the engineer had been, what cargo the train had carried, whether anyone had lived to tell the story. Then he closed the lenses and turned away. There was nothing more to be seen. In the days that followed, the Barb resumed her patrols. She sank a small freighter, then another, each torpedo run executed with the same precision as before. But something had changed within the crew. They moved with a quiet confidence that came not from victory, but from the knowledge that they had transcended fear. They had stepped onto the enemy's shore and returned whole. After that, the sea itself seemed less vast, less invincible. News of the incident reached Japanese authorities within hours, though its cause remained a mystery. Witnesses reported a train consumed by flame and lifted into the air. Investigators found the track twisted into grotesque shapes, fragments of locomotives scattered across a half-mile. At first they suspected sabotage by local dissidents, then a stray American air bomb. Only later, when villagers claimed to have seen a submarine silhouette offshore days earlier, did the impossible theory arise that enemy sailors had come from the sea to plant the charge. It sounded like folklore, and yet the evidence fit nothing else. Fear spread faster than the truth. Rumors told of American commandos landing by the dozens, of invisible soldiers roaming the forests, of beaches haunted by footprints that led back into the ocean. Military police were dispatched to guard the coastline. Fishermen refused to sail at night. For the first time, Japan's civilians understood that the war had reached their own backyards. Inside the Barb, the story became a private legend retold in fragments. Each man remembered a different detail: the cold of the sand, the hum of the telegraph wire, the hiss of the oars. They spoke of it in the cramped galley between shifts, voices low as if invoking a secret shared with the sea itself. Fluckey allowed the talk, but discouraged boasting. He reminded them that what mattered was not the explosion, but the daring that had made it possible. "History," he said once, "belongs to those who imagine it first." When the submarine returned to base, weeks later, her log carried a brief, understated entry. "Successful mission conducted against enemy transportation facility. Result: complete destruction of target." The officers who read it at headquarters blinked in disbelief. The details, when they emerged, bordered on the fantastic. Some doubted it entirely, until photographs of the damaged railway reached intelligence channels. The feat became official only after Fluckey himself verified the coordinates and timing, delivering his report with the same calm tone he used for torpedo attacks. Decorations followed, though none seemed adequate. The crew received commendations. Fluckey, already a Medal of Honor recipient for earlier exploits, refused further personal glory, insisting that the credit belonged collectively. He asked instead that the Barb's battle flag be amended. When the new design was raised, observers noticed something unusual among the rows of enemy ship silhouettes: a small white outline of a steam locomotive stitched near the center. It looked almost whimsical, yet those who knew understood its weight. It was the only such emblem ever authorized in naval history. As the submarine steamed home across the Pacific, the war's final act was unfolding elsewhere. Cities burning, fleets converging, the distant thunder of an empire's collapse. On calm nights, the crew gathered on deck under the stars. They spoke of what would come after: farms, garages, classrooms, wives they had not seen for years. Someone joked that they should have stolen a piece of the rail as a souvenir. Saunders reached into his kit and produced a twisted bolt of metal, rusted and blackened. He had pocketed it on instinct before they fled the beach. The men passed it around silently, each tracing its edges before returning it. No words were necessary. That fragment carried the weight of all they had done. When they reached Pearl Harbor, the Barb entered the harbor at dawn, her decks lined with crew in spotless whites. The other submarines dipped their flags as she passed, a gesture usually reserved for ships lost in battle. In this case, it was for one that had gone further than any of them had dared. The Barb would soon be withdrawn from combat. The war ended within weeks. Yet the story of the vanished train spread through the fleet like fire through dry paper, retold in mess halls and wardrooms, each version slightly different, each beginning the same way. "You won't believe what the Barb did." And always, at the end, came a silence, a pause in which the listener could almost hear the faint echo of that distant explosion rolling back across the years, a sound that belonged equally to audacity and to the sea. When peace came, it arrived like the slow lifting of a fog, sound returning first, then light, then the shapes of things once familiar. For months after the surrender, the oceans still carried the ghosts of war, drifting mines, silent wrecks, oil slicks stretching for miles like dark memorial ribbons. The submarines that had once hunted across that immensity now limped home, their hulls scarred, their crews thin and sleepless. Among them was the USS Barb. She had survived 16 patrols, had stalked the enemy from the equator to the Kurils, and had written into the sea's memory a story unlike any other. At Pearl Harbor, the men stepped ashore into sunlight that felt unreal after so many months of artificial day. They stood awkwardly on the pier, blinking, their bodies swaying slightly with phantom motion. The war was over. The habit of vigilance was not. Newspapers were already calling them heroes, but the word sat uneasily on their shoulders. They had done their duty as it had unfolded before them. Each order followed, each risk calculated, and somehow the arithmetic of survival had favored them. Commander Eugene Fluckey reported to headquarters, his uniform immaculate, his expression calm. Admirals congratulated him with handshakes heavy with admiration and disbelief. The official citation would speak of extraordinary heroism and intrepidity in action, but the captain himself said little. When asked about the train, he merely nodded and replied, "It was a good patrol." In that understatement lay the essence of the man. Decommissioning followed. The engines shut down for the last time, the compartments stripped of personal traces, the battle flag folded carefully into a glass case. Upon it were the emblems of all the Barb's victories, merchantmen, tankers, a destroyer, and, near the center, the small white locomotive stitched in thread. Visitors who saw it years later often smiled at that tiny symbol, assuming it a joke. Only those who had lived the moment understood its solemn humor. It was the Navy's quiet salute to imagination made real. For the men of the Barb, the return to ordinary life proved stranger than any patrol. Some went back to college on the GI Bill, some to family farms, a few to shipyards where the clang of hammers echoed like remembered depth charges. They carried their experiences inwardly, speaking of them only at reunions or in half-finished stories over coffee. The war, they found, was not something one left behind. It simply changed its depth, like a current beneath calmer waters. Fluckey remained in the service for a time, commanding squadrons and teaching new generations of submariners the craft of audacity. He told them that caution alone never wins wars, that imagination, tempered by discipline, was the truest weapon. Yet he rarely mentioned the train. To him it was not a legend to polish, but a reminder that boundaries exist mostly in the mind, As years turned to decades, the Pacific healed. Coral grew over wrecks. Fish swam through shattered steel. In northern Japan, the forest reclaimed the scarred embankment where the explosion had once roared. Only locals remembered the night when the sky caught fire without warning, when an entire train had vanished as if swallowed by the earth. A small monument would later mark the site. A stone with no names, only the date. Wind and rain erased even that. In the United States, however, the tale endured. Historians repeated it in footnotes, naval officers in lectures, storytellers around campfires. It appealed not only because of its daring, but because of its symbolism. A handful of sailors reaching beyond the prescribed limits of their world, daring to touch the enemy's homeland with their own hands. It was a metaphor for the entire submarine war, a conflict fought in silence, defined by courage unseen. When the surviving crew gathered for reunions in the years after, they met in small banquet halls or veterans' clubs. Photographs were passed around, young faces frozen in black and white, the Barb's outline against the sea. They toasted absent friends, told the same stories, laughed at the same mistakes. Always, inevitably, someone would mention the train. The room would grow quiet then, not from sadness, but from reverence. Each man carried a private image of that night, the cold sand beneath his knees, the faint tremor of the rails, the impossible brightness of the explosion reflected on the water. For them, it was more than an exploit. It was proof that within the machinery of war, human imagination could still create moments of grace, acts that transcended destruction and became symbols of will. They had not set out to make history. They had merely followed it to its edge. Fluckey lived to see the new age of submarines, nuclear, silent, immense. Yet he often said he preferred the old diesel boats, where men could hear the sea speak through the hull. Before his death in 2007, he wrote in his memoirs that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. For him, that something had been the belief that no frontier is absolute. Today, the USS Barb rests only in memory, her steel long recycled, her name carried by newer vessels, but her spirit persists in every act of naval innovation that dares to redefine what can be done. Somewhere in museum archives, her battle flag still hangs, the tiny locomotive faded but intact. Visitors pause before it, reading the caption, and smile until they realize that the story is true. And so the legend continues, of the night when a submarine became a ghost upon the shore, when men who lived beneath the waves stepped briefly into the realm of earth and fire and returned to tell the tale. The echo of that explosion still drifts across time, a low, distant rumble beneath the calm surface of history. If one listens carefully, amid the endless rhythm of the sea, one can almost hear it. The sound of a train that will never finish its journey, and the whisper of a submarine sliding silently back into the deep